And kink, I think, is the process of very intentionally and carefully co-creating a story with a partner. And it's a meaningful story. It's the story of who you really are at a level deeper than words.
Our question today is from Kim, who writes that she's going through a bit of a confusing time. She's 22 years old and has only had one relationship that was quite vanilla. She's always considered herself asexual and has had no interest at all in sex until she read a fan fiction story of an aftercare scene. This one story seems to have stirred something in her. For the first time in her life, she finds herself feeling horny and is even thinking about how she wants a relationship like the one she read about in the story.
This actually brings up some really interesting memories of a relationship that I was in.
Story time.
The girl considered herself asexual, and with me was an incredibly sexual, slutty, constantly horny thing because it tapped into the narrative, the meaning of sex for her. When sex was just a set of exercises that had mild sensory pleasure and no particular context, she didn't have any particular interest. And it's interesting to me here that it is a story, a fan fiction story, which are always, there's a pre-existing world, a pre-existing context. That's why you'll see fan fiction is that, hey, I don't want to have to write the entire context of Star Wars or Star Trek. I'm just going to jump into that world and all that work is done for me and I can just tell this one story. And the narratives that those captivations tap into are already archetypal. Star Trek is very much a story of modernity, a story of idealism, a story of a better world in the future through technology and all these things. There's a lot that goes into that. There's anytime you're talking about an ideal, you're on some level talking about what your notion is of God, what your notion is of the future, of what of values. What is better? If you say Star Trek is a better world, well, what does better mean to you? All of that is there under the surface, unconscious, unaware, and you're just telling this one story of Jean-Luc Picard fucking Deanna Troi, and yet all of that is present. And the reason that fan fiction can be so captivating, even in erotica, is because of all that context. So it's not surprising to me that she was reading this, maybe just sinking into that world, a world she already has familiarity with, and then feels the stirrings of sexuality that means something for the first time. It's not just something that the boy she's with wants because it feels good to him. It means something to her. And we can dive into what exactly that is, but just the notion that it was a story is very important.
One of the things this demonstrates more than any of the other recent questions we've covered is how much of kink and BDSM is, as you say in your book, it's all about the perceptual overlay. What is the meaning of the acts that I'm committing to? And in this particular case, she says it was a scene about aftercare. So somebody had sex, presumably, and it was the aftercare scene that really spoke to her. And it was characters that, like you said, she was familiar with. And suddenly the asexual nature of her psyche just vanished out the window, and she discovered a depth to herself she didn't know was there before. And all of a sudden now she's thinking about, how can I be in a relationship where I can get this sort of dynamic going? And it's illustrative of the transformational power of story in digging out of you parts of your psychology or giving you insights about yourself you didn't really understand. She's obviously not been in the real world in a situation where she was made to feel this way with a real person.
100%. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about story and the nature of story, that using stories for telling transformative truths. And these are not factual truths. There's not simple facts. They are understandings that go deeper than fact to produce transformations in your way of being. And for that, you need a story. You cannot just have a thesis. Right? You cannot just have actually, there's a great quote that says, a fact is a truth unsexed. And I've always loved that notion. That's what fiction is for. It's for getting at the truth when the truth isn't sufficient for the truth. And these vehicles that Jesus told stories, the reason that he spoke in parables is because he wasn't trying to communicate facts. He was trying to produce transformations. And thus, storytelling became his mode of operation. The default plan is to respond to a question with a story, because I'm not trying to answer your question factually. I'm trying to change who you are so that question is answered for you. And that's always about meaning. It's always about understanding deep in your soul, in a way that is beneath words, what sex means to her. And so the question I would then, if you were in front of me, would say, what do you think it is? What about that scene really got to you? Which bits of it really got you tingly? And why? Why do you think that is?
What part of
Sure.
also a very illustrative one as well.
What tone do you think these words were spoken in? And yeah, all of those are really interesting vehicles for exploring who we are and what life means to us. How do we learn to be different than we are when we feel an unnamed and unnameable sense of longing and a lack of fulfillment from our current nature of being in the world? Does the world need to change? Do I need to change? Do I need to change my circumstances? What? Something needs to change, because I'm missing something, and the world is not fitted together as tightly as it should be for me. And the only way to get there is through stories and the transformative power of stories from who knows where. Sometimes it's a comic book. Sometimes it's the most trivial of places. You'll be listening to some nonsense. You'll be watching Brooklyn Nine and end up sobbing because something about that moment was the story you needed to hear to start putting that together for yourself. And kink is the process of very intentionally and carefully co-creating a story with a partner. And it's a meaningful story. It's the story of who you really are at a level deeper than words.